September 18th, 1944. Dawn breaks over the rolling farmland east of Arracourt, France. Through the morning mist, a column of German Panther tanks advances, their long 75mm guns sweeping the horizon. These are not the desperate conscripts of Germany's final days. These are veterans of the 5th Panzer Army, men who had fought across Russia, Italy, and now France. They have been told the Americans are retreating, that Patton's fuel supplies have run dry, that one final push will collapse the Allied advance into Germany. Then they see it, a low silhouette, barely 3 meters tall, tucked into a tree line 800 meters away. It looks almost fragile compared to their 60-ton Panthers, open-topped, lightly armored, built on the chassis of an obsolete tank. The M10 Wolverine tank destroyer. German intelligence briefings had dismissed it as a stopgap weapon, adequate for ambushing lighter vehicles but no match for German armour in open combat. The Panther commander orders his driver forward, his gunner tracks the target. Before he can give the order to fire, the M10's 3-inch gun roars. The armour-piercing shell crosses the distance in less than 2 seconds. It punches through the Panther's frontal armour, designed to resist any Allied tank gun at combat range, and detonates inside the crew compartment. The Panther lurches to a stop, smoke pouring from its hatches. Within the next 4 days, that scene would repeat itself again and again across the fields of Arracourt. When the smoke cleared, 39 German Panthers would lie destroyed or abandoned. The M10 Wolverine, the tank destroyer the Germans had underestimated, had just written one of the most decisive chapters in armoured warfare history. This is the story of how American ingenuity, tactical doctrine, and the 3-inch gun of the M10 Wolverine shattered German confidence and proved that in tank warfare, speed and positioning matter more than armour plate. In the autumn of 1944, the German army was bleeding. The Normandy breakout had torn a gap in their western defences. American and British armies were racing toward the German border. General George Patton's Third Army had crossed France in a mechanised stampede that military historians still study today. His 4th Armoured Division, spearheaded by Combat Command A under Brigadier General Herbert Ernest, had reached the Moselle River near the small French town of Arracourt. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But Patton had a problem. His supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles to the Normandy beaches. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition was precious. His tanks had outrun their logistics, and now they had to hold ground while the supply convoys caught up. The Germans knew this. Intelligence reports confirmed that American fuel stocks were critically low. High Command saw an opportunity. If they could destroy Patton's spearhead divisions while they were immobilized, they could stabilize the front, buy time to fortify the Siegfried Line, and perhaps force the Allies into a winter stalemate. The German 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, was ordered to attack. Their target was the 4th Armoured Division's positions around Arracourt. The plan was textbook German armour doctrine. Mass your panzers, strike hard at a single point, break through the American lines, and encircle their forces before they could react. It had worked in Poland in 1939, in France in 1940, and in Russia in 1941. There was no reason to believe it would not work again. The Germans assembled a formidable force. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, freshly equipped with Panther OSG tanks, the most advanced medium tank in the German arsenal. These were not the early Panthers that had suffered mechanical failures at Kursk. These were refined machines, their Maybach engines tuned, their frontal armour sloped at 55 degrees, nearly impervious to American tank guns at range. Each Panther mounted a 75mm KWK 42 L70 gun, capable of penetrating 4 inches of armour at 1,000 meters. On paper, they outmatched anything the Americans had in theatre. German intelligence had carefully studied American armour. They knew about the M4 Sherman, reliable but undergunned. They knew about the M5 Stuart, a light tank useful for reconnaissance but irrelevant in heavy combat. And they knew about the M10 Wolverine tank destroyer. The intelligence assessment was dismissive. The M10 was built on the outdated M4A2 Sherman chassis. It had an open-topped turret, leaving the crew exposed to artillery and air bursts. Its armour was thin, just over 2 inches at the front, barely enough to stop small arms fire. Yes, it mounted a 3-inch gun, but German engineers calculated that even this could not reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armour at combat ranges. The M10 was categorized as a defensive weapon, suitable for ambushes against lighter vehicles, but not a threat in mobile warfare. German tank commanders believed this assessment. Why wouldn't they? Their Panthers had dominated Soviet T-34 seconds on the Eastern Front. They had crushed British Cromwells in Normandy. The Americans, they reasoned, were brave but tactically naive, dependent on industrial quantity rather than tactical quality. The M10 Wolverine was just another example of American pragmatism, a cheap, mass-produced solution to a problem that required German engineering excellence to truly solve. But the Americans understood something the Germans did not. Tank destroyers were not supposed to fight like tanks. The M10 Wolverine was designed around a doctrine that would prove devastatingly effective at Arracourt. American tank destroyer doctrine, formalized in 1942, was built on a simple principle: mobility over armor. Tank destroyers were not meant to hold ground or engage in slugging matches with enemy armor. They were hunters, designed to move rapidly to threatened sectors, ambush enemy tank formations, and withdraw before the enemy could effectively respond. The M10 embodied this philosophy completely. It weighed 29.5 tons, nearly 20 tons lighter than a Panther, which gave it speed and agility. Its chassis was mechanically identical to the Sherman, meaning repairs could be done in the field with standard parts. Its turret could traverse a full 360 degrees, allowing it to engage targets in any direction without repositioning the vehicle. And most critically, it mounted the 3-inch M7 gun, a weapon that fired a 17-pound armor-piercing shell at 2,600 feet per second. The 3-inch gun was not as powerful as the German 88mm or the Panther's 75mm in terms of raw muzzle velocity, but American metallurgy had produced an exceptional armor-piercing round. The M79 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap shot could penetrate 3.5 inches of armor at 500 yards and just under 3 inches at 1,000 yards. More importantly, American doctrine emphasized flanking shots. Hit a Panther from the side or rear, where its armor was thinner, and the 3-inch gun was absolutely lethal. The crews of the M10S knew this. They had trained at the Tank Destroyer School at Camp Hood, Texas, where instructors drilled them relentlessly on shoot and scoot tactics. Fire 3 rounds, no more. Then move. Never stay in one position long enough for enemy artillery to range you. Use terrain, use concealment, use speed. Let the enemy come to you, and when they do, hit them where they are weak. The men of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division, had absorbed these lessons. They were about to put them into practice. On September 18, 1944, the German attack began. The 113th Panzer Brigade, commanded by Major Franz Becke, advanced toward the village of Arracourt from the northeast. Their objective was to punch through the American lines, seize the town, and cut off the 4th Armoured Division's supply routes. Becke was confident. His brigade included 43 operational Panther tanks, supported by Panzer Grenadier infantry and self-propelled guns. He expected to face Shermans and perhaps a few anti-tank guns. He did not expect organized resistance from American tank destroyers. The first contact came at approximately 0700 hours. A platoon of Panthers, advancing in column along a dirt road southeast of Arracourt, crested a low hill. Waiting in concealment along the tree line were 4 M10 Wolverines from A Company, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The American crews had positioned themselves during the night, using the terrain to create overlapping fields of fire. When the Panthers appeared, silhouetted against the dawn sky, the M10 commanders gave the order simultaneously. Fire. 4 3-inch guns fired within 2 seconds of each other, at a range of less than 600 meters, firing at the thinner side armor of the Panthers. The results were catastrophic. 3 Panthers were hit immediately. Armor-piercing shells penetrated the engine compartments and ammunition stowage. 1 Panther exploded, its turret blown completely off the hull. Another caught fire, thick black smoke pouring from every hatch. The 3rd ground to a halt, its crew bailing out under machine gun fire from supporting American infantry. The 4th Panther in the column traversed its turret, trying to locate the source of fire. Before its gunner could acquire a target, the M10s were already moving. Engines roaring, they reversed into deeper cover, relocated 50 meters to alternate firing positions, and prepared for the next engagement. This was textbook Tank Destroyer doctrine, and it was working perfectly. The German response was immediate but disorganized. More Panthers pushed forward, trying to suppress the American positions with high explosive shells. But the M10s were no longer where the Germans expected them to be. They appeared from different angles, fired, and vanished again into the broken terrain. By mid-morning, the 113th Panzer Brigade had lost 9 Panthers without destroying a single M10. Major Bakey ordered his forces to consolidate and reassess. His after-action report, captured by American forces weeks later, noted with frustration, "Enemy tank destroyers demonstrate exceptional mobility and coordination. Their guns are more effective than intelligence suggested. Frontal assaults are not advisable." But the Germans had committed to the offensive. Fuel had been allocated, ammunition expended, and High Command expected results. The attack would continue. Over the next 3 days, the Battle of Arracourt escalated into one of the largest armoured engagements on the Western Front. The Germans threw more and more Panthers into the fight, attempting to overwhelm the American positions through sheer weight of numbers. But every attack followed the same pattern. German armour would advance, confident in their superior firepower and protection. American tank destroyers would wait, concealed, patient. At the critical moment, they would strike from unexpected angles, targeting the vulnerable flanks and rear armour of the Panthers, then withdrawing before German artillery could respond. The M10 crews were not fighting a war of attrition. They were fighting a war of manoeuvre, and they were winning. September 19th brought the heaviest fighting. The 111th Panzer Brigade joined the assault, adding another 50 Panthers to the German order of battle. The plan was to attack simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelming the American defenders and forcing them into a static defense where German firepower superiority would tell. General von Manteuffel himself observed the battle from a forward command post, expecting to see American lines collapse under the coordinated assault. Instead, he watched his panzer brigades break apart against a defense that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper commanded a platoon of M10s from B Company, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. His position on September 19th was a small rise overlooking an open field northeast of Arracourt. He had selected the position personally the night before, walking the ground in darkness to ensure his vehicles would have clear fields of fire and covered withdrawal routes. At 0930 hours, he watched through binoculars as a formation of 15 Panthers emerged from a tree line 1,200 meters away. They advanced in a staggered line, textbook German tactics, covering each other's movement. Leiper waited. His crews were trained to hold fire until the enemy entered the kill zone, the range at which their 3-inch guns could guarantee penetration. At 800 meters, the Panthers were still outside that threshold, especially firing at frontal armor. At 600 meters, Leiper raised his hand. His gunner, Corporal James McKinley, already had the lead Panther centered in his sights. The hand dropped. The 3-inch gun fired, the recoil rocking the M10 back on its suspension. The armor-piercing shell struck the Panther just below the turret ring, a weak point where the armor was thinner to allow turret rotation. The shell penetrated, and the Panther's internal ammunition storage detonated. The turret lifted off in a gout of flame and smoke. Before the other German tanks could react, Leiper's other 3 M10s fired in sequence. 2 more Panthers were hit, one immobilized with track damage, another burning from an engine fire. The German formation scattered, some Panthers returning fire blindly, others attempting to maneuver for better positions. But Leiper's platoon was already moving, reversing down the reverse slope of the hill, relocating to pre-scouted alternate positions 300 meters to the east. By the time German artillery rounds began falling on their original positions, the M10s were gone. This pattern repeated across the entire front. American tank destroyer platoons worked in coordination with Sherman tanks, infantry, and artillery observers. When German armor appeared, the Shermans would often engage from the front, drawing German attention and forcing them to expose their flanks. The M10s, positioned on the flanks, would then strike with devastating effect. It was combined arms warfare executed at a level the Germans, despite their tactical sophistication, could not match in 1944. Their communications were disrupted, their fuel was low, and their replacement crews lacked the training of the men they replaced. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By September 20th, the German offensive was faltering. The 113th Panzer Brigade had been reduced to fewer than 20 operational Panthers. The 111th Panzer Brigade was in similar condition. Crews were exhausted, having fought continuously for 3 days with minimal rest. Ammunition stocks were depleted, and morale was cracking. The Panthers, the invincible cats that were supposed to dominate any battlefield, were being systematically destroyed by a weapon German intelligence had dismissed as inadequate. German commanders began to revise their assessments of American armor doctrine. A radio intercept, decoded by Allied intelligence on September 21st, included this message from a German tank battalion commander to division headquarters. American tank destroyer units are highly effective. They refuse decisive engagement, strike from concealment, and withdraw before counterattack is possible. Our losses are unsustainable. Request permission to withdraw and regroup. Permission was denied. High Command still believed that one more push, one more massed assault, would break the American lines. On September 22nd, they tried. The final major engagement of the Battle of Arracourt occurred near the village of WWII. The Germans assembled the remnants of both panzer brigades, approximately 40 Panthers and a dozen Panzer IVs, for a concentrated attack on a narrow front. The goal was to achieve local superiority, overwhelm the American defenders through sheer mass, and finally break through to Arracourt. American forces, including the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, were waiting. They had used the previous days to refine their positions, pre-register artillery targets, and establish interlocking fields of fire. When the German armour appeared, advancing across open farmland in the early morning light, they were entering a killing ground. The M10s held their fire until the German formation was fully committed, deep into the open ground with limited cover. Then every American gun opened up simultaneously. Tank destroyers, Shermans, towed anti-tank guns, and artillery all fired in a coordinated barrage. The lead Panthers were hit first, blocking the advance of those behind. German tanks tried to maneuver, but the soft ground and pre-registered artillery made movement deadly. Smoke filled the battlefield, obscuring targets and disorienting crews. The 3-inch guns of the M10s continued to fire, methodically targeting any Panther that presented a shot. Within 30 minutes, 14 Panthers were destroyed or abandoned. The German attack collapsed. Surviving tanks withdrew in disorder, leaving their dead behind. The Battle of Arracourt was over. The final tally was devastating for the Germans. Between September 18th and September 29th, the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades lost a combined total of 86 Panther tanks at Arracourt and the surrounding engagements. 39 of those kills were directly attributed to the M10 Wolverines of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The Americans lost fewer than 30 armoured vehicles in total, including Shermans, M10s, and lighter reconnaissance tanks. It was one of the most lopsided armoured victories of World War II, but the numbers only tell part of the story. The psychological impact on German tank commanders was profound. For years, They had been told that German armour was superior, that German tactics were unmatched, that Allied victories were simply the result of overwhelming numbers. Arracourt shattered those beliefs. The Americans had not won through numbers. They had won through superior tactics, better coordination, and a weapon system that was perfectly suited to its tactical role. The M10 Wolverine, dismissed by German intelligence as inadequate, had proven to be a killer. German after-action reports from Arracourt make for sobering reading. One Panther, a commander, whose name was redacted in the captured documents, wrote, "We were told the American tank destroyer was lightly armoured and poorly armed. This is true, but we were not told how fast it moves, how well the crews are trained, or how effectively they use terrain. We expected to fight tanks. Instead, we fought ghosts that appeared, killed, and vanished before we could respond." Another report, from an officer in the 111th Panzer Brigade, noted, "The 3-inch gun of the M10 is fully capable of penetrating Panther armour at combat ranges when firing at side or rear aspects. American crews demonstrate excellent knowledge of our weak points and consistently manoeuvre to exploit them. Frontal engagements are rare. We are being hunted." That word, hunted, appears repeatedly in German accounts. They were not being fought in the way they expected. They were being stalked, ambushed, and destroyed by an enemy that refused to play by the rules of armoured combat, as the Germans understood, to them. The American tank destroyer doctrine, which German planners had dismissed as theoretically unsound, had proven devastatingly effective in practice. The M10 Wolverine's design, which looked like a compromise on paper, was actually a perfect marriage of mobility, firepower, and tactical flexibility. Its open-topped turret, considered a vulnerability by German standards, allowed for excellent crew visibility and situational awareness. Its light armour, seemingly a fatal flaw, actually enabled the speed and agility that made it so hard to kill. Its 3-inch gun, less powerful than German guns in raw specifications, was more than adequate when used correctly. And perhaps most importantly, the men who crewed the M10S understood their weapon. They did not try to fight like heavy tanks. They did not stand and slug it out with Panthers in open combat. They used speed, terrain, and surprise to turn every engagement into an ambush. They were patient, disciplined, and ruthlessly effective. The Germans had expected American tank crews to be brave but unskilled, dependent on superior numbers and firepower to win through attrition. What they found at Arracourt was something different entirely. Professional soldiers executing sophisticated combined arms tactics with precision and confidence. The lessons of Arracourt spread quickly through both armies. For the Americans, it validated everything they had believed about tank destroyer doctrine. The M10 Wolverine was not a failed design or a stopgap measure. It was exactly what it was meant to be: a mobile, lethal hunter-killer optimized for the fluid warfare of 1944. Field commanders across the European theatre began requesting more tank destroyer battalions. Training at Camp Hood intensified, using the tactics proven at Arracourt as the new standard. For the Germans, Arracourt was a wake-up call that came far too late. The 5th Panzer Army's offensive, which was supposed to stabilize the front and buy time, had instead consumed precious resources that could never be replaced. The Panthers lost at Arracourt represented months of production from factories that were already struggling under Allied bombing. The experienced crews killed or captured represented years of training that Germany no longer had time to replicate. But beyond the material losses, something more fundamental had shifted. German tank commanders had lost their confidence. A captured German lieutenant, interrogated by American intelligence in October 1944, was asked about his experiences fighting American armour. His response was recorded in the interrogation transcript. "We were told to fear the Russian T-34 because of its sloped armour and mobility. We were told to respect the British Firefly because of its 17-pounder gun. No one told us to fear the American tank destroyer. That was our mistake. After Arracourt, whenever we saw those low silhouettes with open turrets, we knew men were going to die, usually ours. The psychological impact of the M10 at Arracourt extended beyond individual tank commanders. It affected German tactical planning at the operational level. After Arracourt, German armor commanders became increasingly cautious about committing their Panthers to offensive operations in areas where American tank destroyers might be present. They began demanding better reconnaissance, more artillery support, and air cover that the Luftwaffe could no longer provide. The boldness that had characterized German armor tactics in the early war years was gone, replaced by a defensive mindset born of repeated costly failures. American intelligence officers noticed this shift. A report from 3rd Army Headquarters, dated October 15, 1944, noted, "German armored units are demonstrating increased reluctance to engage in mobile warfare. They prefer static defensive positions where their armor superiority can be maximized." This represents a fundamental change in German tactical doctrine and suggests that recent engagements, particularly Arracourt, have significantly impacted German confidence in offensive armored operations. The report was correct. Arracourt had not just destroyed German tanks, it had destroyed German belief in their armored superiority. Let us examine what made the M10 Wolverines so effective at Arracourt, because understanding this requires looking beyond simple statistics. The 3-inch M7 gun fired a 17-pound armor-piercing projectile at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second. This gave it approximately 5,700 foot-pounds of kinetic energy at the muzzle. By comparison, the Panther's 75mm KBUK-42 gun fired a 15-pound projectile at 3,000 feet per second, producing approximately 6,700 foot-pounds of energy. On paper, the Panther's gun was more powerful, but kinetic energy is only part of the penetration equation. What mattered more was the design of the ammunition and the tactical employment of the weapon. The American M79 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round featured a hardened steel core, a soft cap to prevent shattering on impact with sloped armor, and a ballistic cap to maintain velocity in flight. American metallurgy in 1944 was producing some of the highest quality armor-piercing ammunition in the world. When this round struck armor, it did not shatter or deflect easily. It penetrated cleanly, even at angles. The Panther's armor scheme was designed to resist frontal attacks. Its front glacis was sloped at 55 degrees and was 80 millimeters thick, giving it an effective thickness of over 140 millimeters against projectiles striking perpendicular to the surface. No Allied tank gun in 1944 could reliably penetrate this armor at combat ranges from the front. But the Panther's side armor was a different story. The upper hull sides were 40 millimeters thick, essentially vertical. The turret sides were 45 millimeters. These thicknesses were adequate against small arms and shell fragments, but they were vulnerable to any dedicated anti-tank weapon at combat ranges. The M10's 3-inch gun could penetrate 45 millimeters of armor at over 1,500 yards. At the typical engagement ranges at Arracourt, between 400 and 800 yards, it could punch through Panther side armor as if it were not there. The key was getting into position to take that shot, and this is where American doctrine proved superior. The M10 crews at Arracourt did not try to penetrate Panther frontal armor. They maneuvered to shoot at the sides and rear. They used terrain to conceal their movements. They waited for the Panthers to commit to an advance, then struck when the German tanks were most vulnerable. This required patience, discipline, and an intimate understanding of terrain. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding officer of the 37th Tank Battalion at Arracourt, described the American approach in his post-battle report. "Our tank destroyers used every fold in the ground, every tree line, every stone wall to conceal their positions. They allowed German armor to pass within killing range before firing. They coordinated their fire to hit multiple targets simultaneously, creating confusion and preventing effective German response. This was not luck. This was the result of intensive training and a doctrine that emphasized mobility and tactical flexibility over armor protection. The Germans, by contrast, were constrained by their own doctrine. Panther crews were trained to engage targets at long range, using their superior optics and gun to destroy enemy armor before it could close to effective range. This worked well against Soviet armor on the Eastern Front, where open terrain and long sight lines favored the Panthers' advantages. But at Arracourt, the terrain was broken, sight lines were limited. The Americans controlled when and where engagements occurred. The Panthers' long-range advantage was negated, and their vulnerability to close-range flanking attacks was ruthlessly exploited. There is another factor that contributed to the M10's success at Arracourt: mechanical reliability. The M10 used the same powertrain as the M4 Sherman, based on proven commercial truck and tractor components. It was not sophisticated, but it worked. The twin General Motors 6-71 diesel engines in the M10A1 variant, or the Wright Continental R975 radial engine in earlier models, were robust and easy to maintain. Parts were interchangeable across hundreds of vehicles. Field repairs could be completed in hours, not days. The Panther, by comparison, was a maintenance nightmare. Its Maybach HL 230 P30 engine was powerful, producing 700 horsepower, but it was complex and temperamental. The Panther's transmission was notoriously fragile, prone to failure even under normal operating conditions. German mechanics required specialized tools and parts that were often unavailable in the field. A Panther that broke down was often a Panther abandoned. American after-action reports from Arracourt noted that several Panthers were captured intact, abandoned by their crews not because they had been hit, but because they had suffered mechanical failures and could not be repaired before American forces overran the position. This mechanical reliability translated directly into tactical availability. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion maintained an operational readiness rate of over 90% throughout the Battle of Arracourt. Even M10s that were damaged in combat were often back in action within 24 hours. The German panzer brigades, by contrast, saw their operational strength decline steadily throughout the battle, not just from combat losses but from mechanical attrition. By September 25th, some German tank companies were operating at less than 50% of their authorized strength simply because their Panthers had broken down. The human element at Arracourt cannot be overstated. The men of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion were volunteers, trained for 6 months in the specifics of their mission. They knew their vehicles intimately. They understood tank destroyer doctrine not as abstract theory, but as practical reality. Sergeant Joseph Sadowski, a gunner in C Company, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, kept a diary throughout the battle. His entry for September 20th reads, "Hit 3 Panthers today. The training works. Wait for the flank shot. Aim for the turret ring or the engine deck. Fire 3 rounds maximum, then move. The Krauts never see us coming, and by the time they figure out where we are somewhere else. This is how you fight when you are fast and they are slow." That confidence, born of training and validated by success, was infectious. Tank destroyer crews at Arracourt were not terrified of Panthers. They respected German armor, certainly, but they did not fear it. They knew they had the tools, the training, and the tactics to win. That psychological edge was worth more than any amount of armor plate. Compare this to the German crews, many of whom were replacements rushed to the front with minimal training. They had been told their Panthers were invincible, and then they watched those Panthers burn. They had been promised air support that never came, and artillery support that was always too little, too late. The memoirs of German soldiers from this period repeatedly mention the psychological toll of fighting an enemy who seemed to have unlimited resources. Captain Hans von Luck, who commanded a panzer regiment on the Eastern Front before transferring west, wrote in his post-war memoir, "In Russia, we fought an enemy who was brave but often poorly coordinated. In France in 1944, we fought an enemy who was brave, superbly coordinated, and supported by overwhelming material superiority. At Arracourt, we learned that the Americans had mastered the art of combined arms warfare. Their tank destroyers, tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support functioned as a single organism. We could not match that level of integration, and it cost us dearly." The air support von Luck mentioned was another critical factor at Arracourt. The Luftwaffe was virtually absent from the skies over Lorraine in September 1944. By contrast, American fighter bombers, primarily P-47 Thunderbolts, ranged freely over the battlefield. They did not just attack German armor directly, although they did that too. More importantly, they provided reconnaissance, spotting German movements and radioing positions to American ground forces. This allowed American commanders to position their tank destroyers in optimal ambush positions before German armor even arrived. German tank commanders were acutely aware of this disparity. A report from the 113th Panzer Brigade, dated September 23, noted, "American air superiority makes movement during daylight hours extremely hazardous. Enemy aircraft detect our formations and direct ground forces to intercept. We are forced to move at night or in bad weather, which degrades our effectiveness and increases mechanical failures. Without air cover, offensive operations cannot succeed." The report was ignored by higher headquarters, who insisted the offensive continue despite these obstacles. By September 29th, the Battle of Arracourt was effectively over. The German 5th Panzer Army had failed to dislodge the American 4th Armored Division. The offensive had consumed resources that Germany could not afford to lose. The two panzer brigades that had attacked with such confidence on September 18th were shadows of their former strength. The survivors withdrew east toward the German border, leaving behind the burned-out hulks of their Panthers scattered across the farmland of Lorraine. For the men of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, Arracourt was validation. They had proven that their doctrine worked, that their weapon was effective, and that they could defeat the best armor Germany could field. The unit was awarded a Distinguished Unit Citation for its actions at Arracourt, one of the few tank destroyer battalions to receive this honor during World War II. Individual crew members received Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Purple Hearts. But perhaps more important than the medals was the respect they had earned from their opponents. In the final months of the war, as Germany collapsed and Allied forces pushed into the Reich itself, American intelligence officers interviewed hundreds of captured German tank commanders. Many were asked about their experiences fighting different Allied weapons systems. The responses varied, but a common theme emerged. German tankers respected the Soviet T-34 for its mobility and sloped armor. They feared the British Firefly for its powerful 17-pounder gun, but when asked about the weapon that had caused them the most trouble, that had killed the most Panthers, that had changed how they fought, many gave the same answer: the American M10 tank destroyer. One particularly revealing interview was conducted with Hauptmann Friedrich Lang, a company commander in the 111th Panzer Brigade who had fought at Arracourt. The interrogation transcript, declassified in the 1980s, includes this exchange. Question: what was your impression of American armored forces? Answer: they were more capable than we expected. Their Sherman tanks were adequate, but not exceptional. Their tank destroyers, however, were extremely dangerous. Question: why specifically the tank destroyers? Answer: because they fought intelligently. They did not try to match us gun for gun or armor for armor. They used speed and terrain to negate our advantages. At Arracourt, we lost more Panthers to M10 tank destroyers than to all other causes combined. That was when I knew we were going to lose the war, not because they had better tanks, but because they had better tactics. That admission, from a German officer who had believed in the superiority of German armor, encapsulates the lesson of Arracourt. The M10 Wolverine was not a better tank than the Panther. It was not as well armored, its gun was not as powerful, and in a head-to-head duel on open ground, the Panther would likely win. But wars are not fought in laboratory conditions. They are fought in mud and rain and broken terrain by exhausted crews with imperfect information, supported by logistics chains that can succeed or fail. In those real-world conditions, the M10 Wolverine, with its mobility, reliability, and well-trained crews, was the superior weapon system. The Battle of Arracourt deserves to be remembered alongside more famous tank battles like Kursk or the Bulge. It was smaller in scale, certainly, but it was no less significant. Arracourt proved that American armored doctrine worked. It demonstrated that mobility and tactical flexibility could overcome raw firepower and armor protection. It showed that well-trained crews in adequate equipment could defeat superior equipment in the hands of less effectively employed forces, and it shattered German confidence in their armoured superiority at a time when that confidence was one of the few assets they had left. The 39 Panthers killed by M10 Wolverines at Arracourt were not just 39 tanks, they were symbols of German engineering excellence, of tactical superiority, of the invincible Wehrmacht that was supposed to dominate any battlefield. When those Panthers burned, destroyed by a weapon German intelligence had dismissed as inadequate, something fundamental shifted in the psychological balance of the war. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Germans knew it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on To Your Screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.